Friends, an unbelievable incident has shaken France, a case so disturbing that it sent shockwaves across the nation. 50 nuns from one of the most renowned churches in the country were suddenly arrested. But what was their crime? What unholy acts were they committing behind those sacred walls? At first glance, this church was a beacon of faith and charity, a place where people found solace in prayers. But behind its grand facade, something so sinister was taking place that even the strongest hearts would tremble upon discovering the truth. The nuns, once seen as pious women dedicated to God, were caught red-handed in an act so horrifying that it defied all expectations. The veil of secrecy was lifted by a simple worker, an ordinary man who had come to the church looking for work. His job was menial, cleaning the floors, dusting the furniture. But little did he know that his curiosity would uncover the church's darkest secret. Day after day, he noticed unusual happenings, whispers in the hallways, locked doors leading to unknown rooms, and a sense of unease that lingered in the air. One night, fate played its part. As he continued his usual cleaning routine, he stumbled upon something terrifying, something that made his blood run cold. What he saw was beyond comprehension. He knew he had to act fast, for the truth, hidden inside this church, would shake the very foundations of faith. So what exactly was happening inside this sacred place? What terrible secret did these 50 nuns hide? And when the truth finally came to light, what punishment awaited them? Stay with us as we unravel the horrifying reality of this church and expose the dark crimes committed within its walls. The church where this shocking incident took place wasn't just any ordinary place of worship. It was one of the most famous churches in France, a symbol of faith and devotion, attracting thousands of people every day. With its towering structure and breathtaking stained glass windows, this church stood as a beacon of hope for believers. Inside, around 50 to 70 nuns worked tirelessly. They were known for their humility and dedication, always welcoming people with warm smiles. But their role wasn't limited to religious teachings. This church also ran a charitable organization for the poor, a school for underprivileged children, and most importantly, an orphanage where hundreds of children were raised and educated. People trusted the church blindly. Parents left their children here believing they would be taken care of with love and kindness. Worshippers came in large numbers, listening to sermons and prayers, never questioning what went on behind the church's closed doors. But all of this was a facade, a carefully woven illusion to hide something terrifying. A worker, the same man who unknowingly uncovered the horror, began noticing things that didn't add up. Despite housing hundreds of orphans, the building often felt eerily silent at night. Many children who had been seen one day mysteriously disappeared the next, and when questioned, the staff always had an excuse. They were adopted, or they left for a better future. Wealthy visitors arrived frequently, often leaving with children. Yet there was no public record of official adoptions. And most disturbing of all, the orphanage, which should have been filled with children's voices, laughter, and playfulness, was surrounded by an unsettling quiet. Then came the moment that would change everything. A shocking discovery, one that would make the worker question everything he had believed. One evening, as he was cleaning near the orphanage, a hushed conversation between two nuns caught his attention. They were whispering about keeping things quiet and making sure no one finds out what happened last night. The worker felt a chill down his spine. Something was seriously wrong inside this holy place. What was really happening inside the orphanage? Where were the missing children? The answers were about to unfold, and they were more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. The church's orphanage was meant to be a safe haven for the children who had nowhere else to go. People believed it to be a place of shelter, love, and care. But in reality, something far more sinister was happening behind closed doors. The worker, now increasingly suspicious, started paying closer attention to his surroundings. While cleaning, he overheard hushed conversations, saw fearful expressions on the faces of some children, and noticed that certain rooms were always kept locked. But the most alarming thing was that children were disappearing, and no one seemed to care. One evening, a chilling announcement spread through the church. 3 children had gone missing. The news created an uproar among the staff. The priest and the nuns put on an elaborate display of concern, searching the nearby streets, alerting the authorities, and even making public pleas to find them. The police were notified, but despite an extensive search, the children were nowhere to be found. At first, the worker believed that these children had perhaps run away. But the more he observed, the more things didn't add up. There were no reports filed by the orphanage in the official adoption records, yet dozens of children had left in recent months. The church administration reacted too quickly to the news of the missing children, as if they already knew what had happened. Some nuns, who usually remained calm and composed, seemed nervous whenever the topic was brought up. Most disturbingly, despite all the chaos, the priest never seemed genuinely concerned. Days turned into weeks, and no trace of the missing children was found. The case was quietly closed, the authorities satisfied with the church's explanation that the children had likely run away. But deep down, the worker knew something was terribly wrong. Why would children barely 10 or 12 years old run away from a place where they had food, shelter, and security? And why was the orphanage still receiving a suspiciously high number of visitors, many of whom left with children under the guise of adoption? The worker was about to uncover a shocking revelation, one that would expose the dark underbelly of the church's orphanage. And then, just when things seemed to settle, the real horror began. Late one night, while cleaning near the orphanage's lower levels, he heard something that sent a chill down his spine. Faint cries, weak, muffled sobs, the sound of children. Where were these cries coming from? And more importantly, why were they coming from beneath the church? The worker knew he was close to the truth. But what he would soon uncover was far more horrifying than he ever imagined. The rumors about the missing children were quickly brushed aside. According to the church's official statement, they had simply run away. It was a convenient answer, one that put an end to any further questions. But the worker knew something wasn't right. He had seen the fear in the eyes of the other children, noticed the way the nuns exchanged glances when the topic was mentioned. There was a secret buried within the church, and he was determined to uncover it. A few weeks later, the church made another announcement. It claimed that more children had been adopted, taken in by loving families. This should have been good news, but something about it felt forced, unnatural. Families had always come forward to adopt orphans, but never in such large numbers and never in such a short time. It was as if the church was trying to get rid of the children as quickly as possible. The worker had seen with his own eyes how, in a single day, nearly 50 children were taken away by strangers. And what was even more unsettling was that the children left willingly, without resistance, without fear, as if they had been prepared for this moment. The worker could not ignore the feeling growing inside him. Something terrible was happening. He started to listen more closely, to watch every move of the nuns and the priests. He realized that the so-called adoptions were happening in the dark of the night when no one else was around to witness them. He saw wealthy men, dressed in expensive suits, arriving at odd hours, speaking in hushed tones with the church officials. The children would be lined up, silent, expressionless, before being led away. And just like that, they were gone, never to be seen again. The more he observed, the clearer the pattern became. The missing children had not run away. They had not been adopted into loving homes. They had vanished, erased from existence, and no one outside the church had any idea where they had gone. But the mystery only deepened, because despite so many children being taken away, the orphanage never seemed empty. New children kept arriving, filling the beds of those who had disappeared. The cycle continued, endless and unbroken. The worker knew he was on to something big, but what he would uncover next would shake him to his very core. Because one night, as he wandered the orphanage halls, he heard something that made his blood run cold, faint, desperate cries coming from beneath the floor. Something was hidden in the depths of the church, and he was about to find out what. That night, the worker could not ignore what he had heard. The faint cries, the muffled sobs, they were coming from somewhere deep beneath the orphanage. His heart pounded as he followed the sound, step by step, down the dimly lit corridor. The church had a basement, but it was a place rarely spoken about. It remained locked, hidden from sight as if no one was ever meant to enter. As he reached the heavy wooden door leading to the basement, he pressed his ear against it. The sounds were clearer now. Children crying, whispering, gasping for breath. Fear gripped him, but he had to know the truth. He reached for the handle, but before he could turn it, a cold hand grabbed his shoulder. Startled, he spun around to see a nun standing behind him. She was young, barely 25, and her face bore an eerie, unnatural calm. She smiled at him, but her eyes told a different story. A warning, a silent threat. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice soft yet firm. The worker stammered, trying to come up with an excuse. I heard something. I thought maybe the children." "You shouldn't eavesdrop," she interrupted, tilting her head slightly. "Curiosity can be dangerous." He swallowed hard, forcing himself to remain calm. "Are the children okay?" Her smile widened. "Of course. They're just being disciplined. Go back to your work." Her words sent a shiver down his spine. Disciplined? In the middle of the night? In a locked basement? As he walked away, his mind raced. Something horrible was happening down there, and he was going to find out what. That night, the worker couldn't sleep. The nun's eerie smile, her unsettling words, everything about the encounter haunted him. He couldn't stop thinking about the cries he had heard from the basement. What kind of discipline required children to scream in pain? He knew he had to find out. The next evening, he deliberately lingered near the basement door. He waited until the halls were empty, until the flickering candlelight cast long, wavering shadows. Then, with careful steps, he approached the door once more. This time, he noticed something he had missed before, a small gap beneath the door, just enough to let a sliver of light escape. He crouched down and peered through. What he saw made his blood freeze. Inside, the children were not being disciplined in any normal sense. They were being tortured. Their frail bodies trembled as they stood in line, facing the nuns who held long wooden canes. Some of them were strapped to chairs, their faces twisted in silent terror. A few had visible wounds, deep bruises, bleeding cuts, marks of punishment far beyond anything justifiable. The priest stood among them, nodding approvingly as a nun struck a child for disobedience. The worker felt his stomach churn. This wasn't discipline. This was something far more sinister. The priest's voice echoed through the room. They must learn to obey. They must learn to never question. The worker stumbled back, his breath shallow. This wasn't just an orphanage, it was a prison. And if this was their idea of correction, what else were they doing to these children? He had seen enough. It was time to uncover the full truth. The worker barely made it back to his room, his hands trembling, heart pounding in his chest. What he had just witnessed was beyond cruel. It was monstrous. But something told him that this was only the surface of a much darker truth. The next night, he made up his mind. He had to see what else was happening in that basement. This time, he wasn't just going to peek through the gap, he was going inside. Waiting until the church fell silent, he grabbed a mop and a bucket, pretending to be on late-night cleaning duty. Moving cautiously, he approached the basement door once more. To his shock, it was slightly open. Had someone forgotten to lock it? Or was it a trap? He hesitated, then pushed it further and slipped inside. What he saw inside was beyond anything he had imagined. This wasn't just a punishment room. It was a lab. Strange equipment lined the walls, metal tables, surgical instruments, glass vials filled with unknown substances. And in the center of the room, children lay strapped to medical beds, their bodies weak, their eyes hollow with pain. Needles pierced their skin. Strange machines hummed around them. Some of them barely moved. Then he saw them, the nuns, standing around a child, injecting something into his arm. The child let out a weak cry, then went still. The worker clamped a hand over his mouth to stop himself from gasping. They were experimenting on these children. The priest stood at the far end, overseeing everything. His voice echoed in the dimly lit room. Pain leads to obedience, and obedience is salvation. The worker knew then he had uncovered something truly evil, and if they caught him now, he wouldn't make it out alive. The worker's breath caught in his throat as he tried to process the horrifying scene before him. The church basement wasn't just a place of punishment. It was a chamber of human experiments. But as he continued watching from his hiding spot, he realized that the terror didn't stop there. His eyes darted across the room, and he noticed something strange. Some of the children, already too weak to cry out, had bandages across their stomachs. Their movements were sluggish, their faces pale with exhaustion. A chilling realization gripped him. These children weren't just being tortured, they were being used. The nuns worked with unsettling precision, treating the children as nothing more than objects. He watched in horror as they brought in another child, barely conscious, and placed him on a metal table. A nun carefully unwrapped the bandages around his abdomen, revealing fresh stitches running across his stomach. The worker's heart pounded. Had they performed surgery on this child? But why? Then he saw it. A nun reached into a nearby cabinet and pulled out a scalpel. Another held the child down, whispering something into his ear. Words meant to soothe, but laced with the cruelty of what was about to happen. With terrifying ease, the nun reopened the stitches. The child let out a faint whimper, but it was clear he was too weak to fight. What happened next made the worker sick to his stomach. She reached inside the wound and carefully pulled out a small plastic packet. His mind reeled. Drugs. The children weren't just being punished. They were being used as carriers. The church was trafficking narcotics, using these innocent orphans, hiding the drugs inside their bodies, then sending them away under the guise of adoption. The so-called adoptive parents were actually drug traffickers, smuggling these children across the country, only to cut them open later and retrieve the hidden contraband. Some children survived the process, others didn't. But it didn't matter to those running this operation. They were disposable. The worker's hands clenched into fists. This wasn't just abuse. This was a nightmare beyond imagination. He had to escape, and he had to expose them. The worker's entire body was shaking. What he had just witnessed was beyond horrifying. These weren't nuns. They were monsters in disguise. He needed proof, something undeniable, something that would force the world to see the truth. His hands trembled as he reached into his pocket and pulled out his old mobile phone. Carefully, he crouched lower behind the storage shelves and began recording. Every gruesome detail, the experiments, the drugs hidden inside the children, the merciless nuns treating them like disposable objects. He zoomed in on the priest's face as he stood in the corner, observing everything in silence, his expression devoid of remorse. Just then, his worst fear came true. One of the nuns turned her head and looked straight at him. For a second, neither of them moved. The air grew thick with tension. Then her eyes widened in realization. "Stop him!" she screamed. Panic surged through him. He bolted from his hiding place, gripping his phone as tightly as he could. The nuns lunged toward him, their hands reaching, their footsteps echoing against the stone walls. He barely made it out of the basement before they grabbed him. One of them snatched at his collar, dragging him back. He kicked, he struggled, he had to get out. With one desperate shove, he freed himself and ran. Through the orphanage halls, past the church doors, into the cold night air. He didn't stop. He sprinted through the deserted streets, his lungs burning, his heart pounding. When he finally reached the police station, he crashed through the doors, gasping for breath. "You have to listen to me," he choked out. "The children, the nuns, they're killing them." At first, the officers were skeptical. One of them, a high-ranking official, seemed oddly indifferent, even smirking slightly. But then the worker played the video. The room fell silent. The images on the screen were undeniable. The chief of police's face darkened. "We're raiding that church, right now." And just like that, hell was about to descend upon the holy place. The silence of the night was shattered by the sound of screeching tires and flashing red and blue lights. The police had arrived. Dozens of officers stormed the grand doors of the church, armed with warrants and a determination to uncover the horrifying truth buried beneath its sacred walls. Inside, the scene erupted into chaos. The nuns, who had once seemed so calm and composed, now panicked. Some tried to destroy evidence, smashing vials, burning documents, anything to erase their crimes. Others attempted to flee, but the police had surrounded every exit. The priest, standing at the altar, raised his hands in mock surrender. "You don't understand," he murmured. "We were doing God's work." But the moment the officers forced open the basement doors, their expressions changed. What they saw inside left even the most hardened officers speechless. Children, some barely alive, lay strapped to beds. Fresh incisions marked their fragile bodies, the evidence of drugs hidden within them. Instruments meant for medical procedures were covered in blood, the stench of pain and suffering thick in the air. The weak cries of the children echoed through the stone chamber. There was no more doubt. The officers moved swiftly. 50 nuns, the priest, and several accomplices were arrested on the spot. The orphanage was sealed, its doors locked for good. The surviving children were rushed to hospitals, where doctors worked tirelessly to undo the damage inflicted upon them. Some would never fully recover. As for the worker, the man who had risked everything to expose this nightmare, he became a hero. The government rewarded him handsomely, but more than money, he carried something greater: justice for the innocent. Yet, even as the church was shut down, a chilling reality remained. How many more places like this existed? How many more children were suffering behind closed doors? And that, dear viewers, is why stories like this must be told. Evil thrives in silence, but truth can destroy it. If you want to hear more shocking and eye-opening stories like this, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Because sometimes the most terrifying horrors hide in plain sight.